Dr. Thomas Szasz is, of course, the bad boy of the science of psychiatry, or under the circumstances we had better agree to call it the practice of psychiatry. But the trouble with calling him the bad boy of psychiatry is that one runs into the kind of risk one might have run into 2,500 years ago in calling Socrates the bad boy of Hellenic culture. By this I mean that he has stout and formidable defenders, two of them here today, though not themselves psychiatrists, and many out over the world who believe that psychiatry is, well, bunk. That is the simplest way to digest the views of Dr. Szasz, whose 17th book, The Therapeutic State, collects his most recent journalistic writings, designed to continue a long, persuasive, and profound crusade to convince us that there is no such thing as a mental disease unless you can come up with an X-ray or whatever showing that the brain was physically damaged.
Thomas Szasz was celebrated by conservatives for his contributions to the anti-psychiatry movement. Szasz, a psychiatrist himself, dedicated his entire career to protesting the field that he was a part of, publishing against the ethics of psychiatry in the mid-1950s until his death in 2012. In 1961, Szasz had achieved recognition for his book, The Myth of Mental Illness, where he argued against the treatment of mental illness as if it were a physical one. His philosophies expressed a far-right political orientation and conveyed strong libertarian foundations. Szasz's prominence in the psychiatric community made him an ideal footnote for conservatives like the anti-communists and the religious right who spoke out against psychiatry for its proliferation of leftist views. Michelle Nickerson portrays the linkage between anti-psychiatry and the conservative movement by centering on the 1956 Alaska Mental Health Enabling Act. The act became known to many conservatives as Siberia, USA. These conservatives were alarmed at its allocation of federal resources for the construction of a state-run mental institution in Alaska, and believed the feds to be using the facility as a slave labor camp for political dissenters. The notion was a ridiculous one, but it was not unpredictable that members of the conservative movement should hold such a view. By the 1960s, psychiatry had been giving birth to the idea that conservatives, by their inherent political nature, were unwell. Psychiatrists offered correlations between diseases of the mind and conservative ideologies by equating anti-communists and religious fundamentalists with symptoms of psychosis. They recognized patterns of paranoia in anti-communist doctrine and felt that sensitivity to religious experiences indicated schizophrenia. Psychiatrists also targeted conservative figureheads such as Barry Goldwater and Edwin Walker. Goldwater was featured on a Fact magazine poll which asked psychiatrists whether they felt that his mental health made him unfit for the presidency. Edwin Walker, a former United States general, was arrested for leading a protest against the integration of the University of Mississippi and barred from posting bail by the government, who involuntarily institutionalized Walker for 90 days. In psychiatry, conservatives saw a false authority which had unjustly claimed the power to direct culture under the guise of scientific objectivity. Conservatives saw labels of mental health as a way of depicting opponents of the federal government as diseased. Psychiatry appeared to conservatives to be an enemy of freedom and therefore un-American. Thomas Szasz was an ideal representative of conservative ideology for his controversial yet acknowledged place in psychiatry. He had voiced his opinions in many right-wing publications, including the National Review, the Humanist, the Abolitionist, the Libertarian Review, and the Journal for Libertarian Studies. Puzzlingly, Szasz's philosophies were largely divergent from many of the conservative groups who supported him. Though he was championed by anti-communists and the religious right, Szasz's writing reflected disdain for authorities of social repression, including the church. Nevertheless, conservatism utilized Szasz as their intellectual voice in the mental health debate by recognizing in his philosophies a similar drive to free the nation of the subversive nature of the idea of mental health. Szasz's primary objections to psychiatry came from its power in the federal government. Szasz saw the federal government's involvement in psychiatry as a way of enforcing a social standard on the country by branding normalcy as mental well-being. Szasz argued that psychiatry is not a medical discipline, but a social authority, because he could not see any evidence that mental illnesses were the same as physical ones, and he would not be convinced unless an X-ray linked mental disease to structural damages in the brain. He believed that psychiatry had risen to such power because of its insularity, believing that the only person who could actually debate a psychiatrist and sway their opinion was another psychiatrist. Szasz did not see how this could ever happen, though, because he believed that a psychiatrist, by their nature, would never relinquish the power he had over society. Thus, Szasz was disconcerted by the federal government's use of the insanity defense, prohibition of drugs, and criminalization of suicide, because to him, they were all ways the state used psychiatry as a scientific legitimization to increase its power. Szasz's philosophies depict the federal government's allegiance with psychiatry as undemocratic and as an excuse to infringe upon the rights of citizens in the name of medicine. Szasz's views resonated deeply with conservatives for their anti-collectivist views. With him, conservatives could defend themselves against attacks on their sanity and could expose the scientifically progressive state as a subversive and repressive force.